Good evening. Hi, I'm Valerie Steele. Thank you for coming to another session of Fashion Culture. Colleen Hill, who is a curator of costume and accessories here, she and I will be talking about our book, Shoes A to Z, the collection of the museum at FIT.
Hi, welcome everyone. Thank you.
Okay, my favorite shoe in the whole collection, but I didn't get to choose what was on the cover. I was pleasantly surprised that they agreed that this was such a fabulous image. Manolo Blahnik, stiletto, peep toe, with the red interior, very, very sexy, and also something that in the exhibition we had in the first section about anatomy, because of the way it was showing the toes and toe cleavage.
What was really interesting about this project for us was that we were able to work on this beautiful exhibition, which we'll walk you through in just a moment, but also because we were at the same time working on the book, we really got to explore our entire shoe collection, which for a long time we cited as 4,000 shoes. And as we were working on the project, I realized that did not include boots nor single shoes. So we actually have closer to 5,000. And the book really goes through an A to Z, as you can imagine from the title, and also has a chronology of about 100 pairs of important shoes in our collection. But we decided to organize the exhibition a little bit differently, utilizing a lot of the same objects.
So here, the first slide is, again, anatomy, looking at, for example, the toes of shoes and the slingbacks on shoes, with the idea that people often, consciously or not, think of the foot as being like a little body. When you talk about toe cleavage, it's so the toes are like breasts, slingbacks are like exposing your bottom. And so in this way, the shoes are a kind of metaphor for the person who wears them. And again, some of these amazing examples, the ballet slippers and then Noritaka Tatehana's incredible towering ballet shoes that Lady Gaga wore.
And we'll come back to some of these individual examples a little later.
I can't see, you have to talk about those.
Sure. This is another section in the anatomy portion of the exhibition. And essentially throughout the exhibition, we wanted people to think about how it would feel to wear some of these shoes, if they wanted to wear them and could they wear them. So we had a lot of discussions about what makes a shoe wearable, or even more importantly, walkable, and we'll come back to some of those later as well.
So, of course, things like high heels are an immediate part of that. And it was exciting because we were able to get a pair of 17th century men's high heel shoes from France. And that's essential because that was the period when high-heeled boots came from Persia into Europe. They were originally worn by Persian men. If you are a horseback rider, you know that heels are super important to keeping you in the saddle if you have stirrups. And it was also made you taller, so French men immediately seized on this, and then women imitated them. And then, of course, once high heels became associated with erotic femininity, you got more and more high heels. You got amazing kind of fetish boots and high fetish heels. And these were eventually brought into the fashion mainstream as designers like Louboutin started to make shoes that hitherto would have been only sold in a specialized sex shop. Another aspect of shoes and anatomy has to do with how high the boot goes up on your leg. Is it an ankle boot, a knee boot, or a thigh boot? Because the higher it goes, the closer it comes to your genitals. And in a way, that is a little bit like the height of the heel. It's transforming the body into a kind of phallic symbol.
And Valerie, if you don't mind me adding, this was one of my favorite parts of the exhibition, and entirely Valerie's idea to choose only black boots and then line them up according to height, which was a really fun thing to do. So the very tallest are some Saint Laurent boots from the 1980s that you can see there on the end.
What was this section?
This gets into identity, the designer shoes.
Perfect. Dozo.
Our identity section, as you'll see, had a few different components, but of course people often relate to certain brands of shoes. And we also wanted to identify some of the early designer shoes that we have in our collection, and I'll get back to that a little bit later. But in many ways, this section most closely mirrored the way that we organized the book by focusing on specific designers or specific brands, two from each, and organizing them alphabetically.
And people really do identify with brands. Psychologists were aware of that as early as the 1930s. You know, people will say, oh, I'm a Blahnik person, or I'm, a Jimmy Choo person, I'm a Louboutin person, I'm a sneaker person. It's a fascinating thing that people identify not only with clothing brands, but even more intensely, really, with shoes. In a way, I think it has to do with the fact that the shoe is like a little sculpture. It stands there by itself, and in a way you can envision sort of just stepping into it and being like a person there. That artists have sometimes done interesting things with that, showing how the shoe can stand in for an absent person.
And Valerie, maybe this is also a good place to talk about the two books and exhibitions that you worked on previously about shoes.
Yeah, this is the third one. Back in 1998, I was invited to do a book about a lexicon of style of shoes. And so I turned it into an exhibition in 1999, looking mostly at shoes in terms of masculine, feminine, or kind of unisex shoes, and then also different categories like boots, sandals, sneakers, etc. And then in 2012, right? 2013,
yeah.
Colleen and I did Shoe Obsession, which was about extreme, extravagant, and expensive shoes, which were very in at that point. And we had some of the highest heels and some of the most extreme shoes. So we got a lot of shoes into the collection in 99 and 2013.
And here, continuing in our theme of identity, we did a lot of really interesting pairings of shoes. And as Valerie liked to say, shoe are you. So this was really about, do you identify with one or the other, or perhaps neither? But it was this really fun lineup. So for example, are you someone who would wear the gold metallic Fiorucci cowboy boots? I know I would. But also the embroidered boots from the 1990s. Next to those, I would also wear those too, to be honest. But it was a really fun way to kind of explore these disparate styles in footwear.
Yeah, we really did this intentionally, and it was so much fun pairing things together. And the audience really loved it too. One reviewer said, oh, it's just like shopping. This is so fabulous. But I remember with the first show in 99, I had a pair of Birkenstocks, which, the IPO was just put on the stock market today. And this Brazilian journalist made a beeline for the Birkenstocks, and she screamed, no Latin woman would wear shoes like this. So for this show, we paired the Birkenstocks with some Brazilian, very high, sexy sandals.
And you can see a couple other pairings here, minimalism versus maximalism. We explored gender quite a bit. So the boots that are second to your right are by Pleaser, which is a brand. How would you describe the brand, Valerie?
Prostitutes and drag queens.
Thank you. She's always very blunt about things, which I appreciate. And this was actually a pair of boots that was paired with an ensemble from a Hood by Air collection. And we have the full ensemble, of course. Here we just showed the boots, but these were worn by a man on the runway. So also to show that there is a lot of fluidity between designs, especially today.
And the one next to it is Rick Owens, which also comes from sort of a glam rock prototype, which was, again, biological men wearing high heels. Sort of like getting back into their inner pirate and starting to wear earrings, men have started to wear high heels again. Then we had, in addition to anatomy and identity, Colleen had been working a lot on magic when she did her fairy tale exhibition. And so we had a section on magic. We looked at red shoes, we looked at Cinderella's glass slippers, we looked at, flying boots. And so why don't you talk about the red shoes first?
Oh, sure. I was, of course, focusing on the Hans Christian Andersen tale, the red shoes, and it's a reasonably complex tale, but it basically boils down to a young girl who wants red shoes, and they are outside of her status and outside of her class, but she kind of cons her way into getting a pair, and she puts them on, and she's then wears them to church, and from that point forward she's cursed and she can't stop dancing. And the very macabre true ending of the tale is that she has to cut off her own feet, and then the feet with the shoes dance into the forest, which is the most horrific part, I think. And then of course she dies. So it was meant to be this moralistic tale, but it really gives a sense of the power of red shoes as items of seduction, as items of status. And I'll talk a little bit more about a specific pair of red shoes when we get a little further into the talk.
And then glass slippers, of course, with the Cinderella story, have to do with the smallness of the foot. There was a scene in Qui êtes-vous, Polly Magoo, where there's a pompous French psychiatrist, and he's talking about how fashion is all about fetishism, mutilation, pain. He says that's fashion in a nutshell. And so we have the Cinderella shoe, which is, again, this image of sort of, it can be terrifying, the idea of cutting off your toes and heel to cram your foot into a tiny little glass shoe. And the story is very widespread, everywhere from China to France. And we do often think in terms of sexual dimorphism and sort of pretty little feminine feet and big macho male feet. So this is something which is widespread. Mm-hmm. And then the ones with the flying shoes, I mean, you have Mercury's winged sandals, you've got the 7-league boots, and you've got the idea of sneakers now, which promise to make you run faster and leap higher. Tell them about that wonderful film clip that we had in the show.
Sure. We included a clip of the film Like Mike, and I'm sure some of you have seen it, but the premise, it's played by who was then known as Lil Bow Wow, and the premise is that he finds a pair of sneakers that belong to Michael Jordan, and it gives him these supernatural powers. So it has these great moments where, you know, Lil Bow Wow just flies to the net. And so we were able to include a whole reel of really interesting shoe clips from films. There's actually quite a lot of them because they do have this purported transformative power.
And I knew from the beginning of when we just decided to do this show that I wanted to have a shoe boutique in the middle of the show, a sort of a vignette of that, because when I interviewed women about my various shoe books, they always said that the greatest, highest form of shopping was shoe shopping because it was pure pleasure. Well, if you imagine shopping for, you know, a bathing suit is humiliating, but shopping for shoes is just a joy. So we made this very glamorous shoe shop and have the shoes like little candies in a box, just the idea of the pure pleasure principle of shoe shopping. And also the idea of sort of wrapping it in with magic, too, because so many psychologists have found that people really do believe that the right pair of shoes or sneakers will transform your life. So there is this semi-conscious belief that shoes of all kinds of clothing have this immense power.
And now we'll be switching gears to talk a little bit more about individual shoes. And these are the high-heeled men's shoes that Valerie mentioned earlier, so you can get a good sense of what these actually look like. They're also the oldest shoes in our collection.
Right. And of course, Louis XIV wore them and had the red heel on it, which was a sign of aristocracy. My supposed ancestor, Sir Richard Steele, complained once that modern women were not concerned with the kindness of a person's heart, but only with, you know, how much money he had or whether he had red-heeled shoes. And women also quickly adopted high heels. This is only sort of a medium-high pair, but in general, women's high heels in the 18th century tended to be slimmer, narrower heel, and often a higher heel than men. And then in the 19th century, after disappearing and having flats around 1800, as you went into the 19th century, heels gradually grew. This is a really pretty Victorian boot with quite a high heel. Pointy toes in a Vivier for Dior. Again, a high heel, but here the toe seems to be even more physically impinging on you.
And Vivier is, of course, one of the designers that we feature in the A to Z section, and quite notably, when he was designing for Dior, they shared a label. So it was always Roger Vivier for Dior, which was incredibly important at that time. And, of course, Dior being a really essential couturier speaks a lot to Vivier's talent and prestige.
This is a pair of 1930s fetish boot from the Diana Slip Company, which was a producer of erotica in 1930s Paris.
And I think these are 36 inches tall, maybe?
Something
or 30,
like that. They have an incredible number of tiny little buttons that some gentlemen would have been kneeling on the ground buttoning or unbuttoning those. This is from the 70s, so these are Mexican fetish shoes, which nowadays look not unlike what you would have in certain Louboutin shoes, but back then this would have been super extreme. Helmut Newton complained he used to have to always go to sex shops to get the kind of shoes he wanted for his photographs in the 70s and early 80s, but after that you could get anything you wanted at a fashion store. Louboutin, fabulous, his fetish ballerinas. You could just barely stand up holding onto the wall with them, but these are not shoes to walk in. It's to create that extreme look of a ballerina on toe point.
And these are a style that we had borrowed a couple of times, I think, and by the third or fourth time we wanted to borrow them, we said, could we just get a pair? So I think it's also important to note that, of course, everything you see in this presentation and in the book belongs to our collection.
Yes.
I included this because our wonderful editor at Taschen, Sarah Southard, who unfortunately is unable to be here tonight, sourced a lot of great other images. So, of course, we have our beautiful shoes shot by Eileen Costa here at the museum, but also fabulous images like this Steichen photograph from 1925 that really gives a sense of the 20s visible shoe. As hemline shortened, the look of the shoe and decoration and color become much more important. And this is a pair by Pinet, and you may have spotted them in an earlier image from the exhibition. We're quite lucky to have these, but Pinet and Perugia were some of the earliest named shoe designers. So the idea that we think of, Louboutin, Blahnik, and this kind of late 20th century phenomenon of really well-known shoe designers actually begins in the late 19th into the early 20th century.
A wonderful Blahnik. I mean, the shot from behind. It's something that years ago Ann Hollander did an article for the New York Times talking about how certain shoes, just held the foot captive, and there was a kind of erotic sort of S&M feeling about that. And elegant as this is, it does have a very fetishy quality.
And this is another pair of boots by Blahnik that I honestly just included because I love them. And I think he is probably the only designer who could make these wild boots with bands of fur somehow look chic and elegant. And this was a very recent pair we acquired from Mr. Blahnik. Of course, the beauty of working on any of these projects is we get to assess what we have in our collection and see what we're missing and add new pairs. So this was a really beautiful contribution to our permanent collection.
I love, again, these are the Louboutin shoes.
Some of his earliest, yep.
And very famous, first as women's, and then we were given a man's pair. There you go. And the donor, Gordon, is in the audience, so thank you again, Gordon, for giving us these. It's really fabulous. Designers have given us things. Friends of the museum have given us things. We have now at almost 5,000, about 5 times as many shoes as Imelda Marcos at her height.
And this pair of Louboutin is kind of special to me because these were made for and then worn on the runway for a Rodarte collection. They were not meant for regular retail sale, although I argue they would be really good weapons on the subway if you needed them. But I loved them, and so we had these specially made for our collection, I think around 2008.
You know about these.
Yeah, these were quite a special pair from Jimmy Choo. They may be familiar to some of you because they have a sort of pop icon status. This was the style that was worn in an episode of Sex and the City, and Carrie Bradshaw, the character, is wearing these when she's attempting to get back to Manhattan by catching the last Staten Island ferry. And she gets out of a cab and she starts running, and of course one of her beautiful sandals falls off, and she says, wait, I lost my shoe. And then there's this sort of fairy tale music, and they just zoom in on the shoe. So there's really no missing it. But of course, Sex and the City was incredibly important in raising the profile of high fashion shoes in particular. And as Valerie spoke about earlier, it's a type of high fashion that many people can access. Maybe not price-wise, but you can certainly wear these shoes, at least try them on. So it tends to be a little bit more fun and less depressing than regular fashion.
Alaya, of course, who did so many fabulous pairs of shoes.
And this was a really beautiful pair we acquired for Shoe Obsession, and I remember picking them up and getting back on the subway to bring them here, and I thought, I could go the other way and go home, but that would get me fired. So unfortunately, these have never seen anyone's feet, but I love them anyway.
That would be grand larceny.
Exactly. Not good for my then very young career, especially.
Oh, these are fun. These are Chanel shoes. And of course, we had Louboutin once was talking on stage with me about shoes, and he was saying, but high heels are not phallic symbols. Well, of course, it depends whether you accept that sort of Freudian hypothesis, but so many people have become so aware of that idea that you now have shoe designers who will deliberately play with the idea of a gun as a phallic symbol, lipstick as a phallic symbol. So you have these gun shoes. And then these are fabulous. This is also Ferragamo?
These are Ferragamo, yes. And this is his famous F heel. So as some of you may know, he was particularly innovative in his designs, and he worked on carving this wedge made from very lightweight materials. So it wouldn't have been like a heavy wedge or platform like you may have worn. And he's inspired quite a number of designers with this really beautiful, sinuous shape, and of course the brand itself still makes these beautiful F-shaped heels as well.
This is Tom Ford, right?
This is Tom Ford, and this was one of the stars of Shoe Obsession,
yes.
So they're making a
Shoe Obsession
comeback.
was so great. People went through it, and they said things like, I feel like I've died and gone to shoe heaven. And one of the guards came up to me and he said, Miss Val, people sure do love shoes. Oh, these. We couldn't get the originals, but when they made the remake of the famous Prada Flames shoe, we got it. We're still hoping some fashionista will give us their original pair of flame shoes.
Especially the wedges, if anyone's interested.
Yes. Men's shoes are not as interesting, although the issue of quality and price is certainly there. Traditionally, it was the idea of custom-made shoes that was so prestigious, and it entered into so many metaphors, well-heeled versus down at the heel. And still, there are quite a few psychologists who will say, that men ought to pay more attention to their shoes because women will certainly look at the shoes and assess the person's socioeconomic status by their shoes.
And apparently worn shoes are also a sign of depression. These are the things we read when we were working on Shoe Are You, so who knows?
Well, I remember I had a friend whose husband had all of these Jimmy Lobb shoes, and they were so expensive, and they were so gorgeous. And it seemed in a way hideously vulgar, but also fabulous, like the world's most beautiful shoes. And then you see when you have a woman designer doing a female version of men's shoes. This is Bella Freud, and she's put the heel on an Oxford, and she does it in red, and it's a faux skin, and it's very fabulously androgynous kind of shoe. And she actually, in a recent interview with me, she's told me how her favorite thing is to make women look kind of like David Bowie, like boys as girls.
Ooh, I love that.
So girls as boys as girls. Here's the infamous Birkenstocks, which we should all be buying stock in now because they have gone from being ugly and unisex to being incredibly desirable and cool kind of shoe. And the fabulous Versace boots, which have so many things going for them. The metallic, the cutout, so there's as much nakedness all the way up to the knee as there is actually strips of leather and metal. And then also the images of Medusa, such an ambiguous and interesting image to choose as your icon.
I think this is a really good pair to attest to the talent of our conservation team as well, because all of these images you see, they had to work on these shoes to make them stand up, and then installing them in the exhibition was a whole other talent. So it's really important to notice that these look incredibly perfect in the photos, and that is the result of a lot of teamwork.
Hidden plastic and strings, etc.
Yeah, all sorts of magic. We have a little section here on pop culture and shoes, and I am particularly fond of these Beatles boots, and they're actually from Anello and Davide, which is the brand that the Beatles actually wore. And these are from the late 1960s, and these were worn by a woman. They were actually worn by Jane Holzer, if anyone is familiar with her.
Total fashion icon.
Total fashion icon, and she donated quite a number of really great shoes, these and also from brands like Chelsea Cobbler, which we've included in the book, some perhaps lesser known brands that I think made really incredible shoes. And these are some of my absolute favorites. We had this really lucky moment, I would say more than 10 years ago now, where the designers, who are a married couple of this brand of shoes, Pelican, contacted us and said, oh, we used to make these shoes on the Bowery in the 1970s, and people like David Bowie wore them, and we were like, bring them in. So they did, and these are all polyurethane, so they will not last forever, but again, our conservation team has done some magic to make them look great and preserve them as much as possible. And this particular style, which are based on souvenir shoes from the World War II era, from the Philippines, for example, this was a style that was worn by David Bowie. So you can see him perform in them, he's sometimes interviewed in them, and of course he had those long, thin legs, and then he has these tall shoes, so it's really a look. And they're very rare, so we're very lucky to have these.
And then, of course, another iconic shoe, the Doc Martens boot, which was originally intended as an orthopedic boot for old people, and then became sort of a punk icon.
And this pair, I think, Valerie, you acquired for your 1999 exhibition. Right. So it was just after grunge, so they keep seeing these lives lived, and of course they've been quite trendy in recent years as well. This style originated in 1960s, so we've been seeing it ever since.
And then the tabby shoes by Martin Margiela, which are immediately recognizable and so interesting because of the way they look so animalistic. I mean, it's taken from the idea of a tabby sock in Japan, which is just split between the big toe and the other toes, but it still looks rather goat-like.
And this is a really fascinating pair to me because, as you can see, they're signed by Margiela in 1989, and he actually produced these shoes for his very first collection, and part of the reason Margiela did what he did was because he had no money, so the production of his own kind of shoe was very costly, and rather than have them remade for his second collection, he just painted the first ones. So these were really only worn on the runway, but you can imagine how they would have cracked and decayed more over time had they not been given to us. I'm very glad that they were.
Vivienne Westwood, notorious high platform shoes this is similar to the pair that Naomi Campbell fell off, right?
Yes, yeah, in the 90s. So that you can imagine how fun those must have been to wear on the runway. And we're very lucky to have two pairs of the original Nike Air Jordans from 1985. And in fact, we have both colorways. This is the kind of official colorway that Michael Jordan was allowed to wear on the court. The other original colorway was only black and red, but the NBA said you had to have 3 colors, so those were illegal. And these shoes were initially kind of a scandal because Michael Jordan was paid something like $25 million a year for 4 years to have this contract with Nike, and everyone was like, whoa, that's extreme. And they sold out immediately, and within the first year of their sales, I think Nike made $100 million on them. So clearly it was a good investment, and there's still shoes that you see everywhere, still very cool sneakers to this day.
We are so far behind everybody else in collecting sneakers. I mean, we always thought of ourselves as a fashion museum, and there was much more about, women's clothes and women's shoes. And then here, when we started buying sneakers, it was Balenciagas and Chanel's. So we were thinking in that way. And of course, sneaker culture is so intense and so competitive. There are all of these men who snap up things that are produced in very small lots and then sort of save them. So it's very hard for us to compete with that.
It was interesting, though, when we were reaching out to certain brands to acquire new shoes for the collection, for the book, for the exhibition, brands like Louis Vuitton were sending sneakers. So it really attests to how important they've become to high fashion.
Oh, these are really wonderful Pierre Cardin shoes that the late Richard Martin bought for the Fashion and Surrealism show in 1987. They're so fabulous. We had them in the anatomy section because, of course, although these are shaped like the anatomy of your foot, other shoes are not.
And what really interested us in thinking about the anatomy of shoes was actually a professor here at FIT, Ellen Lynch, and she has a really fascinating class called Fashion and Anatomy that I have been able to participate in some small way. And one of the things that she would ask her students was, how wearable are these? And then she would kind of dissect the design of a shoe, and something like this pair from Perugia from the 1940s with a voided arch, believe it or not, is something that would be wearable and reasonably comfortable. So these are the kinds of things that I took away when making certain selections, including these Walter Steiger shoes, which look, well, they are rather extreme, but despite the fact that they're very tall and that they have that curved heel, you can see that the tip of the heel falls just under the center of the heel. So they actually are reasonably comfortable and easy to walk in, believe it or not.
And the front of where this part of your foot hits the ground, it curves up slightly, but not too much. And if you know from your own shoes, if it's really flat, you're kind of going like that. But if it curves too much, you can easily trip and sort of fall as you're moving forward.
Exactly. And these are a great example of shuffle shoes with no toe spring.
Those are Rudowski, right?
They are. And these are from the early 40s when he was working in Brazil. And what's really fascinating, what I didn't realize until we worked on this book, is that he later was really into footwear reform.
Yes.
So quite a leap from his early designs.
Here, your beautiful little red shoes.
Yes, we got these in probably 2015 when I was just working on my exhibition Fairy Tale Fashion, and Valerie very kindly emailed me a link and said, "Are you interested in these?" And I said, yes. They were up for auction early 19th century, what we were already calling flats by that time. And these are made, of course, from dyed red Morocco leather, and that was absolutely perfect because, again, in that Hans Christian Andersen tale, he specifically mentions Morocco leather. It was a lightweight and supple leather that was used for shoes and for bookbinding that was reasonably high-end, but more importantly is the fact that they're red. So they look quite simple, and they do resemble contemporary flats, but they would have been expensive because red dyes at that point in time, pre-synthetic dyes, were quite expensive to achieve. So you can get a sense of why these would have been status symbols and therefore unattainable typically for this little orphan girl in the tale.
And of course, red is also an incredibly eye-catching color. It's not by accident that the three commonest colors used throughout history are red, white, and black. red is immediately visible. And although all color symbolism is culturally created, it's easy for people to think in terms of natural symbolism, like fire and like blood, so that these Noritaka Tatehana shoes, which just glitter, are so extraordinarily striking. And of course, his shoes tend to have no heel, so you're resting on the ball of your foot. He made me a pair, and for a year, right before the Shoe Obsession show, I kept practicing with my trainer on ankle and calf exercises. And even so, I was able to stay in my shoes for only 25 minutes for Bill Cunningham to take pictures, and then I had to get out of them into a nice comfy pair of 5-inch heels where I could actually put the heel on the ground.
I think our idea of what was a high heel then was very warped, too. I remember buying new boots and thinking, oh, the heel's not that high, and they were like 5 inches. I thought, well, just kidding. Everything looks low compared to these. Were you also were we the first museum to collect Tatehana?
I think so, because I remember telling Daphne about his shoes, and they became friends, and she started wearing them. And we were really very early getting them. Now, of course, everybody has his shoes.
And we'll come back to those in just a moment. But of course, we made this comparison in the exhibition. These are actual Capizio toe shoes. And you can kind of see it because this image is quite large. But this was actually a really innovative design from post-Depression era, late 20s, early 30s, that had suede on the toe. So they were meant to last a little bit longer than the typical toe shoe.
Post-World War I or post-Depression?
Post-Depression.
Okay, so late 30s.
Yes.
Okay. And of course, the idea of ballet slippers, that is partly skill, but it's also you have the blocking in the toe of the shoe that will help you stand on point. And this image of standing on point created an idea that the woman was, in a way, floating off of the earth and was sort of airborne in a sense. So it's a very evocative kind of concept of a person moving like that. And I think that that's one of the things that fed into the appeal of high heels, that you seem to be lifted above the ground.
Which is maybe not so much the case for these, which are 16 inches. Yeah. And these we had specially produced for us as well.
Props to Gaga. She didn't give us hers, but these are like the pair that she wore. Oh, and what's his name?
Masaya Kushino.
Yes, Kushino. He's another fantastic Japanese shoe designer who also makes these real sort of works of art shoes. And this is with this amazing sort of human hair.
And my favorite anecdote about this is that our wonderful registrar always looks for things like fur and feathers and materials that are going to be very difficult to import into the United States, but there is no restrictions on human hair, so she was very excited about these.
Oh, and these are Iris van Herpen, who does a lot of things that are related to science. And here it's the idea of, I guess it's magnetic pulling, so the shoes are deformed by the force of magnetism. Zaha Hadid was involved in designing these shoes. And so you have, again, this idea of architects working on shoes and the idea of shoes as art objects, which has become increasingly important. Artists have always liked portraying shoes because they say so much about the person. Think of Van Gogh's portrait of the little worn-out boots sitting on the floor. And so now you have artists and others. You can do new things now that you're designing on the computer with shoes and designing with 3D construction. So all of that, I think, promises an interesting future of shoe design. This is our last one,
This is our last one. This is the back cover of the book. And as Valerie mentioned, she was so pleased to see that beautiful Manolo Blahnik on the front. I am a 60s gal and a big fan of Courage. We also didn't choose the back, but I am still very excited to see this. And of course, Daphne Guinness also wrote a foreword for the book.
Yes.
So that's quite beautiful and special.
So thank you very much for coming, shoe fans. Okay, let's see if I can read some of these questions. My mother gifted me your fetish book when I started working in fashion in 1996. Question for both of you. What's your favorite pair of shoes in your personal collection? Wow, what's your favorite in your personal?
In my personal collection, well, my favorites are a pair of Louboutin shoes I bought in maybe, it must have been somewhere around Shoe Obsession time. And they are incredibly high and painful, but it was the first time I could afford anything like that, so I really treat them as art objects.
Many people say they treat their shoes as art objects. I know when I've talked to people, they say, it doesn't matter, I'll just put them on my desk and look at them. I actually think that my favorite pair of shoes in my collection is the one I haven't bought yet, the pair I haven't bought yet. I think that there's something very enticing about the next pair of fabulous pair of shoes. How long does it take to write a book like this one? Wow, we spent a long time writing this book.
I think we started, the writing is one thing, the compilation of the entire book is another. I want to say we started maybe in 2017. And I had a really fabulous intern, Darnell Lisby, who is now a curator in his own right, and he and I went through thousands of pairs of shoes, and he is very tall and also remembered numbers very well, so he was the ultimate intern. And then from there, we just continued to cull and think about the categories, and then once the A to Z was sorted out and the 100 shoes, we started writing, so it's been 7 years at least.
I mean, going through all the shoes was enormous. And then choosing which shoes for the book and making sure that putting the book together was one thing. And then when that was pretty much well into being accomplished, then we really turned to the exhibition, which is very different from the book, because a book, it's really an important thing to show highlights of your collection. We'd already done a book with Taschen, Fashion Designers A to Z, which was about 400 of the best dresses and outfits in our collection. So this is a natural way to look at a collection, and focusing on designers or shoe designers is natural. But for an exhibition, we wanted to do something that hadn't been done before. And most shoe exhibitions either focus on an individual designer, like here's a Blahnik show, or they'll focus on a category like high heels, like our Shoe Obsession, or sneakers, a type of shoe. And so this was a more conceptual one. When we came up with anatomy, identity, and magic, it just seemed like a new way to present shoes. And it turned out to be an amazingly fun way to present shoes, especially the pairing. Are you, this shoe or that shoe? Which one would you wear? Which one you never, never wear? Here's a question. Is there a specific designer that inspired your research on, and then something's crossed out, on shoes? I don't know. I can't tell what the question was. Are there any other questions from the audience? We have the light in our eyes, but if you raise your hand or stand up, there's someone in the middle wearing a mask.
I would love to know what your favorite and your least favorite pairs are in the collection, if you have those, or if you're willing to say your least favorites.
Well, I think my favorite is either the cover image of the Manolo Blahnik, which I've always really loved, or that late 17th century man's high heel shoe. I think those two are favorites. My least favorite is funny because that was something we got at the very last minute. It's not in the book, but at a certain point, just before the show opened, I said to Colleen, we should really have one of those awful clogs that everybody wears. And so she went out and got one.
Yeah, the Crocs were really funny because, if I'm being totally blunt, we just ordered them on Amazon because they're Crocs. And so I had them sent to my house, which is a little easier than having them sent to FIT, where they have to go through all the internal channels, and they were yellow. And I opened them up, and my husband said, "Oh, God, I hope those aren't for you." And I said, no. I think he knows me better than that. My favorite pair of shoes in the collection are the David Bowie shoes that I mentioned earlier. I just think those are really special, and the entire Pelican collection is something that really nobody else has. I think Bowie's shoes are still technically part of his collection of clothing, so those still exist, but I don't think I have a least favorite, to be honest. I've never thought in those terms, so I will prevent myself from disparaging anyone this time around.
Well, you know, it's funny because shoes do get worn. If you wear them, they get worn out. I remember taking in a pair of shoes to be repaired at the shoe repair person, and he looked at me accusingly and he said, "You've been wearing those shoes." And I had to admit I had, even on the street, but that beats them up. And so one of the things that when you look at the collection, sometimes you'll see something and go, it was a nice shoe back when they first got it in 1973 or something, but now it's kind of beat up and worn. So I think that's, in a way, also that's my least favorite kind of shoe, unless there's something compelling about it. When they're worn out and kind of shriveled. We have a really interesting 18th century pair of women's shoes where one of them was really destroyed by time and water and damage, and the other one sort of A, miraculously escaped that, and B, has been lovingly conserved. And so we like to show them together, like, here is this. We kind of imply that the conservation team transformed it from this abject creature into this glorious one. It's not quite that much, but it does show you the yin and yang of how shoes can be abject and how they can be superb.
We also did include that pair of shoes in the exhibition, and one of the conservators said to me, you know, I could fix up the other one. I said, no, it's actually the point that the other one's yucky looking.
One last question. There's one.
Hello. I would love to learn more about the title of the book. It's not broken out into gender, it's not broken out into time period, it's comprehensive. So maybe you can talk, or I'd love to learn more about that. It's actually how we approach that.
Well, the biggest section of it is by designer, so it literally is A to Z. And then Colleen also does break out through a chronology of shoes. And we had a little mini chronology in the show, but we didn't want to turn the exhibition itself into a chronology because that basically chronological fashion shows are the most old-fashioned kind of show you can do.
And it really was an organic process. It really was about looking at as many of the shoes in the collection as we could and determining from whom we had really great examples. And when you're working with 5,000 shoes, and we included just over 400 or maybe 500 with the chronology in this book, you really have to edit. And so it ended up being a mix of well-known designers, a mix of designers or labels that I was really interested in researching. We wanted to think about both historic brands and contemporary brands, so it ends up happening kind of organically over time. And if I found that we only had 2 really great pairs of shoes from a particular label, we probably moved on to another one where we had 4 great examples.
Yes, it's interesting because we work in a museum, I think we're unusually interested in collections. You know, just in the idea of collections and archives. What gets collected? Who has the power to decide what's collected and what's exhibited? And so that was a very interesting process for us to go through the whole collection and think about, how did these get here? What else might we have collected had we been thinking, say, more about men's shoes or more about sneakers early on? Because you could imagine other collections having a different kind of focus. And of course, not everything is possible. I would have loved to have those McQueen armadillo shoes, but when a pair came up for auction, they went for $60,000, which was too rich for our purchasing budget. Thank you again so much for coming. Thank you.